All right, we're going to go ahead and start here. Sorry about the delay. We're waiting for everybody to get sat. It was standing room only in here, but thankfully Erica brought in some chairs in the back. My name is Daniel Phelps. I'm really stoked here to present some of my work today, at least some of the research that's been going on behind the scenes, and to discuss an idea that I had a couple years ago that I pinged off of Blair McIntyre and Jay Bolter. So, I want to thank Dr. Bolter, Dr. McIntyre, Dr. McGurko, and Dr. Zinman for, their constant pushing me into the correct lane of focus on this idea. So I just wanted to talk about my background a little bit, if this is going to work. There we go. I have 22 years in media arts and education. I have an MFA in integrated media arts from Hunter College in New York City. I got my MS here, and I'm a PhD candidate in digital media. More specifically, one of the reasons why I came to this program was to work in the augmented environments lab, which exists in one form or another. So I want to thank Dr. McGurko for allowing me to do some of this work in his lab for this semester, which is pretty great. It's a great program to be in, and it's one that I champion to everybody that I can talk to about it. So yeah, I started off my life as an editor in television, specifically nonfiction. I graduated with a BS in communications with a concentration in nonfiction, non-studio television production. So believe it or not, that's exactly what I went into after I finished my undergrad. In Sacramento, California, I was able to work for a few different companies, producing television shows, scripted and non-scripted. I was a grip, I was a PA. I started to do cinematography when I moved to Los Angeles, and live television direction. From there, my interest started to change as I moved to New York. I joined an MFA program at a very dense, very diverse institution at the University of New York. I work with folks like Stuart Ewan at the grad school in the University of New York and at Hunter College. And I learned from some of the best grassroots nonfiction storytellers out there. And it's really that time in my life has kind of really influenced all my personal work since 2010, I think. And it's really here when I went to art school that I discovered my passion for illusionism, and this idea that our mediums in which we interact with are malleable in form, and that we can take a look at the affordances of those and apply them in new and different ways. So this doesn't only pertain to the arts, but it also pertains to commercial endeavors, and it's one that I'm trying to better understand from an artist's point of view, and more importantly, I'm a practitioner. So some of the artifacts that you see on the screen, specifically the bottom three, back in 2010, I don't know if you guys remember 3D TVs were all the rage, and at that point in time, I had a lot of interest in this technology as a medium to play with. So before you could actually purchase 3D cameras, I was building my own 3D cameras and projection systems and using them in industry. So I have, I kind of have two different personas, right? When we talk about performance, I have performance in my creative work and performance in my kind of industrial work, where the money comes in. And I think all great artists have those two venues that they work in and out of. Moving forward to some of my work in VR, I was an early adopter for the Oculus Rift, developing installations for that within the Lane Gallery in New York. I also started to get into 360 video and robotics, mainly to bypass some of the drawbacks in 360 or VR video, stereoscopic video, which essentially is when you're recording in VR or in 360, there is no behind the camera. So I took this as an opportunity to play with the relationship as a director and a producer to define where it was behind the camera that I reside. And if you look at the top right, there's kind of a little big planet. This is from a project I did called the Future American Retrospective, and it was funded by the New York City Council. It was also funded by the Artists Union in New York for University of New York, and this was a chance to document conversations in the LGBTQA plus community at a hyper-local level. So more importantly, we looked at folks that had been engaged in the fight for the LGBTQA plus community and invited them out to have discussions over a series of 3 days. And this was in conjunction with the Wagner Archives and the Queens Public Library. We took these unedited conversations, unedited interviews, and we made them freely available online without any editing, without any conjecture, where you are at the center of this conversation. And the eye lines, more specifically, the eye lines of the conversation happening in 360 video go through the interactor. So if you were to put a set of VR goggles on, you would be in the middle, the literal middle of this conversation. And you can see some robotic stuff. I developed a remote control, widely over-engineered robotic device in which I can light and record from a distance, where I was not an influence. And this exploration in not becoming part of the influence or not exerting my bias in storytelling has persisted with me today. This project was turned into obviously an archival project, but it was also showcased at a gallery in Queens for 6 weeks. And I actually hauled this thing out to Queens Pride, and we had it up for that one-day event. And it was at the end of the festival. So there's nothing like having a lot of people experience your work in a public venue, and that's really kind of where my work resides, is out in the open, in the public. I was fortunate enough to also receive a couple grants through NASA initiatives. Specifically, I worked at York College, and we were a minority serving institution. Specifically, we were a PBI, and I was able to, through the Department of Performing and Fine Arts, recruit students in the pre-engineering program, computer science, data science, and we worked on 2 separate projects in conjunction with NASA. One being a project with swarm robotics, so using AI and swarm communication to control. You see these 3 robots here. We essentially controlled these robots to search out minerals for the surface of Mars. That's what we were simulating. I think I had about 25 or 30 students come through this program, and I'm super happy to say that they are all employed in their perspective roles at different companies in New York City. I also did a project called Medstroids. That was part of a NASA project to understand and explore lunabotics, so robotics on the moon for mining purposes. Now, one of the reasons why I always talk about this when I discuss my background is because these experiences with not only these students, but with the technology expanded my curiosity about the affordances and how we could bootstrap different technologies together to create different experiences. And it kind of led me into my research here today. So it wasn't until really recently that I realized that my research revolves around illusionism. This is a concept in art history that has to do with optical illusions and 2D art. So some books this optical illusion book is fantastic. Read on it, but my interest goes back all the way to magic eye posters. If you are a child of the 90s like I am, you will remember these as things that you saw walking past in the mall next to a Hydrocolor t-shirt. But these are digital optical illusions that hide 3D images in stereo. By shifting the convergence on your eyes, you could see 3D images, and your brain would interpret this noise pattern as a 3D image. Can anybody see these? Does anybody have problems with these? Can you see the 3D image? I've been working in 3D for okay, so you know, without getting too much into it, Magic Eye, you could. The idea was to look through. You have to decouple the convergence of your eyes with the actual plane in which the poster sits or the work sits. So this idea of decoupling, you know, kind of a conscious and unconscious native physiological need for the body to see in 3 dimensions, to perceive depth without any other depth cues other than this decoupling is a primary focus in augmented intermediate layers. I did a project here as well where I took the idea of an augmented intermediate layer, and this is something that I'm going to get to in a bit. But this is called the Wonder Glove. I did this at Nietzsche's class, and it was a fantastic project. But you know, the big question or the big idea was, you know, what if magnetic fields had material properties? And as I was researching this idea of an augmented intermediate layer, and more specifically at the time, 2 years ago, it was called an augmented interactive layer. But what this glove does is it has Hall effect sensors on every fingertip and piezo vibrators on every fingertip, and it uses an individual microcontroller for every finger to sense electromagnetic radiation. You can sense not only magnets, but EM fields and walls. And it translates to an individual analog experience to each one of your fingertips. And it was an unbelievably fun and successful project that I did not get working until the 11th hour. But yeah, this is just a physical embodiment of an intermediate layer that comes between a digital layer that comes between the interactor and the world. Another kind of research project that I did, this was about 10 years ago, is I had a great professor, Dr. Stuart Ewan, at the grad school, or the grad center, City University of New York. He gave me, he knew that I had an interest in stereoptics, and he gave me a very rudimentary set of lenses meant for wartime stereo photography of enemy combatant territory. And the idea is that this would be used in conjunction with a map that was recorded in stereo, put down on the map, and you could see depth from images taken from spy planes and satellites. It's obviously something that's no longer in use, but the adaptation in the primary genesis of this comes from one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the late 1800s in the stereoscope, postcards. So I actually filed for a patent for the iPhonoscope or the iPhone stereoscope, and this combined the iPhone or a digital device, which was just emerging at the time, with these lenses using stereoscopic capture from a camera that I built that you saw earlier. It took 3 years, way too much money to find out that I had prior art that I displayed. So I essentially gave a talk about this at a conference, and that was the day that my prior art started. So I learned a really good lesson in IP management and development, is that you don't talk about it until the paperwork is filed. So this actually ended up turning into be a Google Cardboard or a version of it. I pitched this as a paper product to Kellogg's, and they passed on it in late 2011. But that idea of the decoupling of one's senses is something that's been around for a long time. We have, looking at lenticularity in postcards. So I have a lenticular postcard that my daughter just received a couple weeks ago, and this same idea of creating motion on a flat surface using lenses as an intermediate to a very strictly defined 2D substrate is repurposed and reconfigured and, as Jay would say, remediated today in a product called the Looking Glass. So this product is a consumer product that you'll see my daughter here too, that uses a lenticular lenses over the top of a 4K display to give the interactor a horizontal only 3D view. The canvas that interfaces with the lenticular display is split up into 128 strips. These strips represent each eye, and the lenticular lenses direct the left eye and the right eye, but in this case, we're adding motion to it. So this idea from 120 years ago is being remediated into consumer technology as we see it. Now, some folks call these holographic displays. I think holography is, I think holographics is a marketing term, where holography is an art form that uses lasers and all sorts of interesting substrates. But this medium in which I started studying 2 years ago kind of profoundly changed me in a way, but I understood its limitations. And more importantly, is that we're still looking at a screen. We are not looking at the real world. And the fact that we are not looking at the real world through a digital intermediate changes our relationship with the world and the medium in which we're absorbing. So if you folks are familiar with the Brunelleschi experiment, it's a series of experiments in the late 17th century, I believe, Second Renaissance. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm no art historian, but this idea of anamorphosis, and anamorphic work, and playing with the perspective of the audience and the interactor. So in this case, the Brunelleschi experiment, and this is from Reality Media, or actually some work I did with Jay and Blair on converting the book Reality Media into a web page that is developed in OpenXR, is that the user holds up a painting in a real world space with a hole in it and then a mirror. And that mirror reflects the painting back into the eye, but transposes that painting into a real life environment. It's a very primitive form of augmented reality. So with kind of understanding some of these things, I decided to say, well, what would that look like with modern technology? And I kind of got close with a project called Transcendence. It's the artifact that you see on the right. This is a stripped down LCD display where the polarizers are actually, within this iframe here. So as you look at the screen doesn't show anything until you look through the polarizers, and that polarizes the light so you can see. And when you combine this with projection mapping, you can create a really interesting use of single point perspective, hopefully one that will come through here in this video.
It builds upon the memorial's narrative, introducing visitors to the experiences of one specific narrative, the story of Jesse Washington. The AR viewport projects video footage of Jesse Washington's final moments story within the pavilion. Hosting one guest at a time, this experience provides a singular emotional journey while also interacting with the pavilion's design, creating a solitary, emotional point of view for the guest. Here, we see what's revealed in the viewport.
So if you want to see the rest of that video on Transcendence, it's on my website, danielphelps.com. You can look at my featured work or my portfolio. It's there. Transcendence was a fantastic interdepartment experiment with architecture and digital media, in which we took concepts of augmented and virtual reality and applied them to in this case, it was a textile installation at the Memorial Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a national lynching. And that project actually won some awards for its creation, but it also led me to look at architecture as a medium, right? And this is nothing new. So that project was a couple years ago, and over the past year and a half, I've been working with architecture and some folks in the architecture program to better understand that one of the core principles of illusionism is the fact that you can take a canvas and change the audience's perception of what it is, what it can, and what it can't do. And Andrea Pazzo, in this is Italy, Rome, I believe, created some really great pieces of work. This is just one example, but if you look at the example on the right, that perspective is from directly below the work. And the work is painted on the ceiling, a vaulted ceiling, with a lot of intricacy. And from this perspective, Andrea Pazzo was able to introduce depth cues. These depth cues on a 2D surface, as they interacted with the windows, okay, and the rest of the structure, chased a version of realism that hadn't really been seen before. It hadn't been seen until the late 17th century. And this idea of perception of anamorphosis and creating single and dual point perspective hadn't really yet been popularized. Now Bruno Skelly popularized a lot of that, but this changed the way we saw media, 2D media in particular, and the church had a lot to do with this. And this was, this was a reality that was as close to perfection and godlike, and really did have an effect on those who were fortunate enough to see some of this work in its existence. And it's within that power that anamorphic work and illusion in 2D art that I find compelling, especially when you combine it with the affordances of 2D screens in our environment. So kind of building on some of this anamorphic work, I have a piece coming out hopefully soon here on campus at Georgia Tech. This is at what's generally called the Media Bridge. It's an inverted LED panel on the ceiling of a footbridge that connects Crossland Tower and the library. So cloth, it's called cloth, right? Cloth, yeah. But this is a really, really interesting canvas. And it's one that I immediately was drawn to, so much so that I have been working on this piece and how to make it as illusionary as possible over the past year and a half. As it sits, what's projected on the page, or what's projected on the LED panels, the inverted LED panels, is a simulacra of the inhabitants within. There are digital animations, movement, characters, with equal representation, but more importantly, these are lit and simulated with contextual awareness. This project was created with the original tools in Rhino, SketchUp, Lumion, that the architects used to pre-visualize the product, to pre-visualize this installation. So I took those tools, reused them to create a simulation in which I could contort, stretch, and redisplay on this inverted medium. And ultimately, this works from two different perspectives. One perspective over here by the stairs, if you're familiar with that space, the other perspective coming from the promenade. For it to be effective, depth cues like reflection. You can see reflection of the doors and of the walkway are seen. So, this volume I've experimented with filling with water and fish and wildlife. It looks quite amazing, surreal. But this only really works from a single perspective, that point in which the anamorphic work is resolved. And ultimately, we can see this in the commercialization of anamorphic perspective. We're starting to see this type of work more and more in Times Square. I know that there's 3 of them now. But this is a single point perspective anamorphic piece this one is in Taiwan, I believe. And folks are calling this naked eye 3D. That is the marketing term that has been applied to this style of 3D illusionism on a 2D surface. Now, this is just a really, 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 really bright matrix of LED panels that can be seen during the day. And they're actually on a corner in which, from a single perspective, or I would rather call it a cone of perspective, because your height and your relationship to this work influences the D-squeeze, the anamorphic part of this work. So it essentially, if you can get the camera in the right spot, it looks fantastic. It looks realistic, but it is still 2D in form. And one of the reasons why anamorphic perspective like this, like of Andrea Pazzo, photographs so well is because you are recording a flat 2D surface on a flat 2D capture device, a CCD or a CMOS sensor. Okay, the camera as a 2D surface, the chip as a 2D surface, they resolve spectacularly. So if we take some of these technologies and kind of redefine where they sit, as artists, as industry recognizes the reconfigurability and the reconfigurability and the affordances that these technologies, as they're bootstrapped together, what that conveys, how can the technology and the user experience be remediated? So this kind of leads me around to understanding where augmented intermediate layers fit within experience-based taxonomies. So augmented, now I finally got to the meat and potatoes of this. It is an augmented intermediate layer is user-focused transparent medium. Okay, whatever that means. But it's user-focused. It is not meant to be kind of recognized as a device. It's not a head-mounted display. Okay. The term digital intermediate comes from my film days, in which we would shoot film, analog film. We would process it. We would scan it. We would edit it. We would color time it, color correct it, add special effects as a digital intermediate, and then we would output it into a physical film form, an analog format. So the digital intermediate is no longer really used. I mean, it's kind of used in certain situations, depending on the pipeline and process for narrative and non-narrative films. But I repurposed this term as an augmented intermediate because that's exactly what it does. It is contextually aware and it's outside in tracking. So unlike some of the examples that I just showed you with the commercialization of this anamorphic perspective, rather than being a fixed point in space in which the display resolves for, an augmented intermediate layer makes that roaming. It tracks the user. It is outside in tracking as opposed to inside out tracking, as we would, understand VR and AR head-mounted devices. The augmented intermediate layer is interactor independent. It doesn't care who you are. It's focused on privacy, and that is more of affordance with being able to cater the technology and the experience to anybody who steps in front of it. Okay, breaking down some of these barriers that are burdening AR and VR adoption, which is the tools to create, the how hard it is to make it look real if realism is something that you're trying to achieve. The integration, how many pieces, non-standardization, pulling these out of the equation, I believe, will help augmented reality adoption, but create it in a form in which maybe it's not called AR, right? And if it's a form that's not necessarily called augmented reality, well, we're redefining what it means to to create, to understand, to theorize what an AR experience can be. So this kind of combines reality, media, and illusionism in a way in which is new and exciting, and it's some things that we can see today, but it does it in a way that kind of pushes back trends in which the commercialization of the technology is, well, for lack of a better term, trending. So not quite AILs, it's this naked eye 3D, it's that billboard that you saw. It's off-axis image projection. This is a term that you would use when developing this technology in Unity or in Unreal Engine or in Blender. Holograms is one that I don't necessarily partake in, but it's not a hologram. It's not presented as 3D. It has depth cues in 3D, but it's not presented as 3 dimensions, at least not yet with some of the affordances that we have. And it's also not persistence of vision systems. These are LED systems that move, that spin, that replicate a holographic kind of voxel medium, and it's not that. This is an intermediate that lies between you and the real world, one that reacts to you, one that you don't have to react with, a different type of performance. So we can see this going back to, this is a AIL in situ. So in the real world, this is a very primitive, basic version of an augmented intermediate layer. And this version is quite effective as it works for 1 or 2 people to pre-visualize or re-visualize what was in a space. But it doesn't take you out of that space. It keeps you in. It mediates the space for you. In this example, in a very simple manner. There's another piece that I found, another example of an augmented intermediate layer. This was actually designed supposedly by a 14-year-old. And it's a projection system in a vehicle that projects onto the substrate of that vehicle to make it, I don't like the term, but make it invisible, right? To make the unseen seen. And it's quite an interesting, experiment into how this technology can be used to influence safety, right? Not necessarily art and entertainment, but in this case, safety. So there's also another version of this. And if some of you are thinking about the Milgram Kenosha spectrum of mixed reality, that's where this one sits. This is a portal. This is a virtuality portal. This is an advertisement that was done in Unity that uses user-based tracking to adjust perspective on the fly in real time in 3D, creating an illusion that uses a 2D screen as a 3D effect. It's pretty rad. So where does this illusion sit? This one right here. Where does this one sit? Now, when we think about the research that's gone in and the big thinkers in this area, Paul Milgram and Kenosha created this idea of a mixed reality kind of continuum, a spectrum, in which we can define all different types of experiences from the single level of perspective, right? So we have the real environment, we have augmented reality, which puts a digital simulation in the real world. We have augmented virtuality, which puts the real world in a digital simulation. And then we have the virtual environment, okay? I think that augmented intermediate layers kind of sit somewhere in between, As the real world, this is it, you can intercept vision in the real world with a digital intermediate, and if you do it with such subtlety, it becomes a different experience. And hopefully I can kind of explain what this means. I'm bearing the lead, so forgive me. So we can take a look at transparent displays, right? how can we use transparent displays in new ways? How can we use novel motion tracking, user tracking systems that detect gaze, position, rotation? How can we use attachments? You know, this kind of, I don't prefer this type of user tracking, which in this case, these are Vive trackers. I would prefer more of a data vision, machine learning type of approach where, you know, the screen looks at you. How do we use, you know, malleable, you know, truly malleable, you know, flexible screens that are also transparent? How can we use these things together? So, you know, in asking these questions, I was fortunate enough to receive a seed grant through Georgia Tech and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory to do some research with their data visualization folks at the Vista Lab. And this is what we came up with.
This demonstration reflects the affordances of transparent OLED displays used in an augmented reality experience. TOLEDs are semi-transparent light-emitting displays used in advertising and digital signage industries.
Thanks to OLED's self-emissive pixels, transparent OLED can be more transparent than conventional LCD transparent displays. This slim and sophisticated design can also show clear and vivid color. Also available as a standalone type, according to your needs, the size and design of the transparent OLED signage can be customized and expanded by connecting multiple displays together, producing a bigger wow effect.
Currently, there are several companies that provide these panels to consumers. The affordances that transparent light-emitting screens allow within the context of AR applications and optical user tracking will be explored in this video. I call it the Augmented Interactive Layer, or AIL. Utilizing tracking technology that combines well-established OpenCV libraries, Unreal Engine plugins, and simple webcams, the parallax needed for simulating a one-to-one manipulation of the real-time framing in a scene can be achieved. When combined with the affordances that TOLEDs provide, we can see that a truly immersive effect can be achieved using off-the-shelf technologies. In this case, our simulation reflects the pre-visualization of a 3D model in advance of its printing on a consumer 3D printer. However, the unique abilities of this technology combination are limited by screen size, focal distance between the real-world simulated target and TOLED screen. That is, for the target destination to achieve the AR effect, the depth of field of the eye, and in this case the camera, must lay outside the target in the screen. Otherwise, the focus on both target and the mid-display cannot achieve uniformity. The demonstration that we see in the video allows us to understand this problem. However, this distance can be compressed using readily available folded optics that change the focal point of the screen or target volume, allowing them to be simultaneously in focus. As you can see, this effect is successful in its preliminary attempt. Still, future iterations of the application of an augmented interactive layer will go beyond novelty. By using current and next-gen hardware to precisely gauge user position and gaze or frustrate, we can create a more convincing and immersive simulation. Specifically, technologies such as transparent micro LED displays, flexible TOLEDs, depth sensors, laser trackers, and especially camera tracking systems utilized by the special effects industry will allow us to create living volumes rendered in real time for scientific, artistic, and data visualization applications. This research into AIL technology is provided by funders.
So that's it. This is a novel form of AI. Okay. This is something that has been played with, has been applied in all different data viz and digital media circles since 2009. Okay. This is nothing new. This is a new application of it using transparent screens. But that's just where it sits now. That sits in the mind's eye because we can have access to transparent screens. How do we keep an eye on other emerging technologies, and how can this emerging technology be applied? And more importantly, from a theory perspective, how does this fit? How does this fit within reality media? How does this fit within media itself? And how do we kind of build upon Paul Milgram's work and redefine this? So this isn't my research. I'm just kind of putting it out there. This is research that was done about a year and a half ago. And this, in essentially, what a lot of theorists are, like myself, are trying to do is redefine where some of this work in practice sits, right? How can we position it in the idea of mixed realities? How does it sit? Because obviously it's different, right? It's not the same. It has its roots in that, but the experience is what differentiates it. As I said, this is a novel form of AR, but the experience is completely different. So a lot of the work that's happening right now with Smith, Witten, and Scarbeck, in this particular example, there's a lot of work happening in this, and ultimately I learned something really interesting in this research is the more novel you think your idea, your research is, the less reading you did on your literature review. So, but that's something that happens with folks that file for patents and this work. So how do we build up upon this other work? Well, in this case, and it's not necessarily something that I agree with, but this reimagining of the mixed reality spectrum into an experience space, a different type of continuum that uses, which is very interesting in this respect, that uses kind of a 3D plotting system to break apart the work into extended world knowledge. So this is how the experience, how the effect, how the technology sees you and interacts with you. The reproduction fidelity, so how convincing it is. And then the extent of presence metaphor. So I personally find EPM as the defining kind of departure point from the Milgram spectrum, in that the extent of presence is really what's coming more and more into play. And ultimately, it's what our commercial overlords are trying to achieve, okay? So I think AIL kind of fits within there. And as this kind of as this subset of research into mixed reality continues, I'm sure that will evolve. So I do have some ideas on future implementation. Some of these ideas were shown in the video, but using large format displays. This isn't, and maybe Janet's listening or not, but this isn't Hamlet on the holodeck. This is bringing in your outside world into your literal field of view using newer technologies. These are all things that are in the real world today. How can we imagine their reconfiguration or remediation in a way that we can apply to something like the moving the moving panorama, or in this case, the Barker Rotunda. How can we see the parallels, not only in the reprojection of these surfaces and the use of modern technology in older formats, but can we combine transparent displays with transparent buildings into a rotunda fashion where all the interactors on the inside are seeing a remediated and augmented version of the world for themselves? I have a project called Electrovironment. It's on my website. You can take a look at it. But it discusses this technology and this remediation into an artist's experience of kind of redefining colonization and environmental concerns from an indigenous perspective, where the world, the context of which the installation matters the most, and where the technology dissolves into something else altogether that only affects the experience and doesn't make it something that the audience considers as a technological augmented reality experience, just an experience itself. So that's about it. That's all I got for this. You can clap, you can clap, you can clap. It's all good. I mean, it's a filled room. I'm surprised it was that quiet. So yeah, I can end this. And I'm going to put it out there to the folks on the live stream as well. See if anybody wants to have any chats about this. Yes. What is your question?
Why?
Presence? Well, I think that the presence idea goes back to the redefinition of the spectrum, where this the extent of the metaphor. In this case, Skabarex, Smith, and Wittenson call this, this experience, this EPM. And I didn't use this. I didn't use their figure here, but they call it a matrix-like experience. Once you start to involve, things that very creepy companies like Neuralink are trying to do with human-computer interaction, inputs and outputs, that is something completely different. From the experience standpoint, and Janet would hit me if she was here, but a seamless experience, an augmented reality experience in which you absorb, but it's not necessarily something that you say I'm interacting with. So a good example is, and this was talked about in the 70s, right? Is this idea of an interactive window. When you wake up, and there's actually a Kickstarter that just went up 2 days ago with using a transparent interactive shade that kind of extends this idea. But when you look out the window, what do you see? Do you see the real world? Can that window digitally augment your perception of there? Can it repaint? Can it put your day? Can it put your calendar in a perspective in which that becomes closer to reality? Is this digital integration, right? And an augmented intermediate is meant to be something that goes beyond novelty, right? It's meant to be something that you don't have to deliberately interact with. And I think it's one of the reasons why I changed the term augmented interactive layer to augmented intermediate layer, to give it some flexibility with that. Because as you walk up to one of these transparent screens that updates for yourself, it can do it, based on the aesthetics that are kind of designed into it. It can do it in a myriad of ways. Yes.
Find novelty in it, or people's perception change because you're working with emerging technologies and they don't have a benchmark. Yes, it's very new to them as well. What is the success metric for a project?
Well, that's a good question. What are the success metrics of a good project? Well, I would say that you need, quantitative data, right? So something that I didn't mention here is, this idea of taking an augmented intermediate layer and trying to commercialize it. I created a company called RUI. It's ARUI.group. It's the RUI group. And it is taking this idea, this concept, and integrating it into car windshields. And there's kind of two reasons for this. One, you can get quantitative data, right? You can test it. You can say, does this make the car driving experience, and particularly semi-autonomous vehicles is what I'm targeting, does this make the experience better? How do you define better? Does it make it safer? Safer is easier to define, right? So it's by kind of having some of the qualitative and quantitative measurements there, but also designing an application of in this case, augmented intermediate layers that fits within a framework of research, right? Like this can fit within, lots of automotive data research and things like that. But more importantly, what's unsaid is that by taking an AIL and putting it in a vehicle, you are foregoing some of its deficiencies. More importantly, the deficiencies of it only really works in this form with one person. As it tracks the user, it tracks the user's gaze as they move. Well, you have to design an experience in which to do research where somebody is there. Maybe they're sitting, in the case of a vehicle, but it's only reacting to that one user perspective. Okay, but it does it in a way that it puts the data out in 3 dimensions. So, and we can take things like if we use a car windshield, for example, you can intercept a user's vision to create real stereoscopic depth in the image that you see. So as I'm looking out into 5 cars in front of me, my vision goes wall-eyed because I'm looking out. Whereas if I'm looking in on a car dashboard, my vision comes in and it converges. So by monitoring the convergence or deconvergence of the user's eyes, we can intercept on a 2D plane a 3D image. So that just means we can do it cheaply and effectively, whatever effective means. So I hope that answers your question and didn't ramble on too much. Anything else? Cool. I think that's my time. Look at that, 1 hour on the money. If there's no other questions, if you think of anything, my email is danielphelps@gautech.edu. You can go to my website. I just rebuilt it, so I'm promoting it for some reason. If you find a spelling mistake, keep it to yourself. I'm usually always available, and it was great to talk to everybody here today.